pretty sure most people who read in philosophy have that one or two philosophers that they just come back to time and time again. So every year, other year, you find yourself picking up their works and kind of reading them afresh. And every time you find something new in those works. And, when I read William James, who's that guy for me, it doesn't feel at all like academic philosophy. It feels like he's kind of articulating certain things that, maybe I've been intuiting or something like that, but he just does a really good job of kind of fleshing that out. So recently I've been reading his work, Pragmatism and the Will to Believe, and The Meaning of Truth, and some other of his works. And I'm finding that the pragmatic theory of truth is, every time I read it, it's quite attractive. But every time I read it, I think in my head of some objections, and I see some objections that James had to deal with during his time. And I think, it seems to me like people aren't really necessarily understanding maybe the theory of truth the way I understand it. Not to say that my understanding is superior, I don't know if it is. But I wanted to do a short video kind of articulating the way I kind of think of the theory of truth, because it makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm hoping that people who may be confused by it or whatever can look at this explanation and say, oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense. So, of course, for those who don't know, William James is a philosopher, an American philosopher who wrote a lot during the late 1800s and early 1900s. He lived from 1842 to 1910. And I think in order to appreciate his pragmatic theory of truth, we have to first appreciate the fact that before he was a philosopher, he was a psychologist. So in the year 1890, he finally published a book that I think took decades for him to articulate, and it was called Principles of Psychology. And in this book, Principles of Psychology, he's writing at a time when psychologists got most of their data basically from introspection primarily, thinking about what it feels like to experience, what it feels like to think, and also sometimes from observation, but a lot of it really was about internal experience and kind of reflecting on internal experience. And for me, maybe aside from David Hume, I feel like William James is the guy who really can detach himself from his own experience, maybe the best of all. So the stuff that we experience and we don't really think a lot about, William James was really able to do that. So why is it important to realize that he's a psychologist first? Well, in order to understand what he's trying to do with the idea of truth, we have to understand that for James, we always start with inner experience. We always start from our own experience. So we like to imagine the world as this car is. So we like to imagine the world as being there. And we're like that car who's in the world, but there's this world outside of us. Now, James doesn't deny that there's this objective world outside of us, but he likes to remind us always that whenever we start thinking about anything, we are almost always positioned as the driver of the car, us looking out into the world from our own experience. It's not like the car where we can see ourselves as part of the world. We always look outward. We can imagine ourselves as part of the world, and we pretty well know that the world is out there and it exists. We're not solipsists, but every time we do anything, we have to start as from a place of our own subjective experience looking out into the world. So here's why this is important, because for James, the question is not so much what is truth as a property of the world or a property of our ideas aligning with the world. The question James wants to ask is, what is it about an idea that has to happen for us to experience that idea as true? So in his book Pragmatism, James has a quote. He says you can say it either as it is useful because it is true, or it is true because it is useful. Both of these phrases mean exactly the same thing. Now this is kind of confusing because we like to think of truth as a property of the world. When an idea is true, it's true because it reflects the outside world. Well, not so fast, says James, because we know that world exists and we know there's probably facts about the world that are the way they are. But in order to call an idea true, the true is almost like an adjective. So let's take James's phrase and transpose it onto another phrase. So you could say something like this. We can say of it either it produces that effect in me because it is beautiful, or it is beautiful because it produces that effect in me. So let's think about linguistically what this is doing. When we say it produces that effect in me because it's beautiful, we're saying that beauty is the property of the thing that explains why it produces that effect in me. it's almost a descriptor of the thing rather than my experience of the thing. But when we say that latter part, that it produces that effect or it is beautiful because it produces that effect in me, we're kind of switching that around. And now we're saying beautiful is the descriptor that I use to describe anything that produces that effect in me. And that's kind of what I think James is saying about truth. Truth isn't a property of the object, and it's not a property of the idea that comes from it aligning with the object. It's a descriptor that I use to describe a certain effect that is produced. So when I have the experience of an idea being true, I do so not because it is true, because we don't know if it's true independent of our belief about it. It's because it's true is like the word beauty. It's a descriptor for an idea. To say that this is a true idea is to tell you something about the idea. So James's question is, what am I telling you about the idea when we say it's true? And we can't just say, well, I'm telling you that it's true, because that begs the question. So when experience is all we have, which is James's starting spot, what are we saying about an idea when we say it's true? How do we come to know an idea is true? In the same way as how do we come to call an idea beautiful? And for James, we come to call an idea true when that idea is useful. When we put that idea to the test and it gets the results that we expect it to get. So when I give someone directions to my house, the idea of those directions becomes true when it successfully helps them get to my house. Now, it may also be that there's another way to get to my house, and I could give someone those directions, and for them, the idea of the directions to my house are true when it successfully gets someone to my house. So for me to say these are the true directions to my house signifies they will be effective in helping you get to my house. And we can think of the same thing in terms of science. So when we think of science, what we like to think of is there's this way the world is out there, and there are these, true descriptors of the world that just haven't been uttered yet. And the goal of science is to get to those true descriptors of the world that haven't been uttered yet. And we like to think that an idea is true regardless of our experience with the idea. So let's say that we came across an idea that described the world really well and was accurate, and later we would call true. But we discarded it, we tossed it in the trash because we were infatuated with another idea, let's say. The idea that we just tossed in the trash that really describes the world really well, most people would want to say that idea is true, irrespective of whether we believe in it. We threw it in the trash, but we shouldn't have because the idea itself is true. James, because for James the idea of truth is a descriptor for the idea, would like to say no. It's not true until we experience it as working, and maybe until we experience it as working better than alternative ideas. So think about this. Think about two different cultural groups who are trying to figure out how best to predict when it's going to rain so that their plants will grow properly. And there's several different ways you could do that. So one group might kind of invent, meteorology, and they might be able to predict it that way. Another group might invent some other system that may be more supernatural, but somehow it gets the job done. Let's just say that just by sheer chance it gets the job done. Another group might invent another way that's different. Now, we're tempted to say, of course, that the idea of meteorology, so far as we know, is the true one, and the other ideas aren't the true one. And I think James would agree with that, actually. I think that James would say that the reason we're correct is that if the other group were to put their idea to the test long enough, they would realize that their supernatural idea doesn't actually work, and that our idea of meteorology works better than their idea. They would discover that. But the difference between most people and James is that most people would want to say, well, therefore our idea is true, their idea is false. And James, in some way, would probably want to say, well, until they realize their idea doesn't work, they have no way to know that it doesn't work. So the idea really is true for them as they experience it. Not because there's different truths and I know my truth and you know your truth, but because when we experience an idea as true, that means the idea works for us. And if it works for us, we have no way of knowing and no reason to think that it's not true. So in some ways, James is describing the world as I think it is. In any number of questions, you have different people who disagree on what the true is. So some economists say that greedy capitalists were the cause of the 2008 crash. Others say that it was the result of bad government regulations. Still others say that it was just an inevitable result of capitalism producing inevitable booms and busts. Which one of these is true? Well, of course there's probably one correct answer to this. But what that means is that there's one answer that, if we really pressed the issue, would work as an explanation better than other answers. But James would want to say, until we figure out which answer it is that really does work better than the other answers, then all of those competing proposals, as long as they work to explain the phenomenon, actually are true. Because remember, true is a descriptor that we use to describe ideas, not the things that are actually out there in the world. So there may be one belief that ultimately commands all of our allegiances, but until that point, since it really is about experience, all of those competing ideas are going to be true for the people who believe them, because they have no reason to think those ideas don't work. It's only when we find reason to think that one of those ideas works better than the other in practice that we come to agree on what the truth is. So James, I guess what I'm saying is, starts out with a different idea of the function of the word true. True is the descriptor of the thing, kind of like beauty is the descriptor of the thing. And it's not that it's a property of the thing itself, it's a property that we impute onto a thing. Just like I say it's beautiful because it produces a certain effect in me, we say it's true because it produces a certain effect. So, I don't have time or inclination in this video to go over some of the criticisms of the pragmatic theory of truth. I'm sure you can find those elsewhere, but that's kind of a helpful way for me to think about it. You start with experience, and true becomes the word you use to describe an idea and its effects, just like beauty is the word we use to describe the effect something produces.